Greetings. Building Smart USA is fortunate to host this inspirational presentation by Scott Yates, whose message is as well crafted as the title of his presentation. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much. Super excited to be here. I've presented a few times now as a part of this Building Smart webinar series, and I really enjoy it. So once again, I'm excited to be here. I appreciate all of you that have taken some time out of your busy Wednesday to dial in and listen to what I have to say. I did put some effort into this presentation as much as I put into the title of the presentation as well. We love our puns and our acronyms, as you'll hear today on the presentation. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about asset data's critical role in operational readiness and airport transfer, known as ORAT. I sincerely hope that we have some people outside the aviation industry also participating, because the concepts that we'll be talking about here most certainly go beyond the aviation industry. I think you'll find that they're very applicable to any asset intensive industry. All right, without further ado, let's jump in. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name's Scott Yates. I'm the Director of Digital Transformation in the Strategic Consulting Group at Woolpert. I've got 20 years of asset management consulting experience. Most of that time spent running a asset management consulting firm that did enterprise asset management system implementations. So I've spent the majority of my career kind of on the operations and maintenance portion of the asset lifecycle, working for owners and operators of large facilities, many of those facilities being airports. I'm also the data chair for the Building Smart USA Airport Working Group. I'm very passionate about the role of data as we move towards the digital transformation and technology evolution that's taking place across all our industries, but certainly the aviation industry as well. So, as we talk about things like digital twins, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these capabilities are run on, or data is critical to their ability to provide the value that they can provide. And so, a passion of mine is working with owners and operators to get their data houses in order such that they'll be in a position to leverage that technology. So before jumping into the content of the presentation, I want to get, to that end, some disclaimers out there. This is not going to be an overly technical presentation. Certainly, if anybody wants to get into the technical details, you can reach out to me offline outside of this presentation. I'd be happy to nerd out with any of you as it relates to these concepts and technologies. But I really feel, with my experience and my role within Building Smart, is to try and take a lot of the super technical stuff that we do here and make it accessible to everyone, and kind of provide that bridge to people who may not be super technical as to why they should care about open BIM standards. And so, my history is representing owners and working in asset management. And so I think it's a little bit of a unique take on BIM and open BIM standards. And so I try and really convey that. My main objective here today is to provide talking points to all of you, whether you be an owner operator who is looking to leverage BIM methodologies in more ways in your organization. I strongly encourage that, and I want to provide you some of the talking points to help do that. Or if you're on the design and construction side, if you're a contractor, I want to maybe open your eyes to some of the ways that you can provide value to owners and operators beyond simply designing and building the physical facility. So just a little disclaimer on setting the tone for this presentation. And to continue to do that, I like to start with thinking about the paradigm of what is BIM really. And, I come at this again, I think from a unique position, with most of my experience being in asset management across the last 20 years. I've only really been exposed to virtual design and construction heavily in the last, 5 years or so, maybe a little more than 5 years. And, I think this perception is out there that BIM is software. And furthermore, that BIM is specifically for design and construction. So I think there's, large groups of people out there who, when they hear the term BIM, immediately equate it to design and construction software. And I think in doing so are missing huge amounts of value that could be that could be received from BIM. I think the reality of what BIM is that it's a methodology. It's a methodology for creating, sharing, and managing information about an asset throughout its entire life cycle. And so, I think this paradigm shift and this education around what it really is important. And I'll continue to speak it from my soapbox, because once we have that paradigm shift, we're able to kind of take the guardrails off and look at where BIM methodologies and BIM technologies can help other business processes within our organization. I firmly believe, and we're seeing it with things like digital twins, that BIM is going to be the backbone of enterprise asset management as we move forward. So just kind of want to put that out there, that and get people thinking kind of outside the normal swim lane of BIM being software for design and construction, and kind of expand our minds a little bit. And I think you'll see that this presentation goes right in alignment with that. The other thing I'd like to get out there before getting into some of the detail is one of my favorite quotes. It's a George S. Patton quote: "A good plan executed violently now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." I say that for two reasons. One, a lot of what we're talking about today, I'm guessing, is either relatively new to your organization or may not be something that your organization has fully adopted yet. And, I just want to get across that that's okay. These types of paradigm shifts, cultural changes, technology adoption does not happen overnight. But thinking about it and getting started on it is always a good thing, and is going to put you in a position to get as much value as possible. Also, we're talking about a business process today, which is about planning for future operations. And so, I think this quote goes hand in hand with the logic behind the ORAT process as well, to say, hey, let's get out ahead of things, let's put a plan, and then let's start executing. Let's not overanalyze or get paralysis by analysis. A step in the right direction is a positive step. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what operational readiness and airport transfer, ORAT, is. We're also going to talk a little bit about digital asset data delivery and data interoperability and what that is. Back in October, I did a more detailed presentation just on that topic, but we're going to go back through some of the basics. And then we're going to bring those two things together and talk about how accurate early asset data can benefit the ORAT process. And so, the thread that I'm going to try and kind of weave through this presentation is that by getting access to asset data earlier in the process and utilizing BIM and open BIM standards to do that really puts organizations in a better place to prepare for the grand opening of new systems or large facilities. We really want to put, owners and operators in a position where grand openings are a celebration and not just a crisis to be survived. All right. So ORAT, what is it? Why do we do it? That's where we're going to start. And I'd like to start by showing this graphic where we can really kind of see the value of asset management and where it comes into play across the asset lifecycle. Because I believe ORAT is just really an asset management process. I talk at length about how asset management begins in planning and design, and ORAT is a process that bridges that gap and does that. It brings asset management discussions and asset management related activities earlier in the process of a project, such that we're in a better position to manage that facility or system when handover occurs. And so, I think this is a very eye-opening graphic where if we look at this gray dotted line, What this is trying to say is that when we look across the entire life cycle of an asset, our opportunities to affect total cost of ownership decrease significantly as we move through the planning, design, and construction phases. You know, while 75% of what's ultimately going to contribute to total cost of ownership occurs in the operations and maintenance phase, the reality is that the decisions that are made in the planning, design, and construction phase are going to lock in a large percentage of that total cost of ownership. And so, you know, bringing asset management earlier in the process and doing more proactive and strategic planning is going to put you in the best possible position to fully leverage the assets of a facility or system across their life cycle. And so, you know, a couple messages in this diagram are simply saying, listen, majority of the cost is on the back end, but it's locked in based on activities we do on the front end. And then it also talks about how, you know, if we put proactive planning processes in place, we can greatly reduce that total cost of ownership over the life cycle of the asset, facility, system, whatever it may be that we're talking about. And I think this is a good foundation or premise for talking about operational readiness and airport transfer, because it is a process whereby we're bringing those asset management principles up earlier in the project so that we can take advantage of some of this and put ourselves in the best position to operate the facility. Looking at this specific term a little bit closer, so the acronym specifically stands for Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. There's other ones out there: Operational Readiness and Airport Transition, Operational Readiness and Transition. All of them fit into the nice ORAT acronym, but ultimately, you know, they all mean the same thing. So the definition of this, what this is it's a systematic and structured approach used in the aviation industry to prepare for the opening or expansion of airport facilities. So it's something that airports have been doing for a long time. I've worked with airports that have a internal dedicated team to ORAT. Some large airports with a significant number of capital projects going on at any given time are going to have dedicated teams. I've worked with airports that contract this activity out as a part of a large capital project. And then I've worked with airports that don't formally recognize, you know, have an internal team or contract out this operation, but still do these things. These are things that still ultimately get done on capital projects. And, you know, basically the objective here is we're trying to ensure a smooth and efficient transition from static to dynamic operations while minimizing any operational disruptions during that process. So, you know, looking at an airport, opening a new terminal facility is an immense undertaking. You go from operating in one building with all its systems, all its tenants, all its stakeholders on one day, to the very next day, you're in a completely new building with newer, you know, potentially upgraded and more advanced systems, and you still have all those same number of tenants, stakeholders, general public involved. And so that is an immense transition to take place in a very short period of time. And so what ORAT is about getting out ahead of that transition and ensuring that plans are in place for operating that facility to its utmost when the doors do finally open to the public. And we're going to talk about what some of the components of ORAT are, the ORAT process. So ORAT begins with planning activities, and these activities really should start as early as planning and design of the capital project itself. And so some of the activities that take place as part of the planning phase is stakeholder engagement. You know, so obviously we want to have a good understanding of, you know, who's going to be using the facility, who's affected by the facility, understand their needs and how it relates to how the facility has been designed, and so that we can start to put together a concept of operation. For those of you familiar with terms from the military, this is sometimes called CONOPS. But basically, we're starting to develop the operational concepts of how the facility is going to be used, who's going to use the facility, and therefore what types of systems, processes, procedures, policies contingency procedures do we need to have in place so that we know how to operate this thing once it's up and running. So it begins very early in the capital project process, where we're trying to look ahead at how that facility is actually going to be used and who's going to be affected, so we can get the right things in place to maximize value. Kind of the next major phase of ORAT relates to training. So once we have an understanding of how the facility is going to be used and how that, how the use of that facility may differ from the existing facility, and we've started to develop our standard and contingency operating procedures, now we want to actually prepare individuals to be able to do the things that are defined in that concept of operation and are defined in those standard operating procedures. So some of the activities that take place related to training, and now, with these activities, we're likely closer or into the construction phase of the project and bridging the gap into commissioning and ultimately opening. But there's activities around familiarization. So simply getting stakeholders aware of what's coming is a huge training activity in relationship to ORAT. Traditionally, there may be site visits or virtual tours of the facility to get people familiar with what is coming down the pipe. There's operations training. So as we look at the standard operating procedures, we need to train individuals on what those procedures are, particularly, again, if they're changing significantly from what they were previously in the old facility. And then it gets all the way in as we get closer to opening and things have been installed, we get into equipment training. So beyond just, the higher level procedures on how we're going to operate the facility, we get into actually training on the specific systems and equipment that's going into that facility, and make sure the people that are going to use it, people that are going to maintain it, know what they're getting into when that facility opens. The next major phase of ORAT is testing. So, as construction is winding down and we're getting into commissioning and then ultimately handover, we're doing testing and commissioning. And so some of this is, testing and commissioning of the specific physical systems and equipment that's going in, but some of it is testing and dry running the SOPs and the contingency operating procedures. So we have a concept of trials, both basic trials as well as advanced and integrated trials, where we're actually testing out scenarios. We're actually running through scenarios in the facility that's been largely built, but not yet opened, right? Where we're dry running how certain activities are going to take place, activities that are ultimately crucial to the safety, security, and efficient running ultimately of the airport. Then, of course, there is handover of the facility. So as we get into execution, there's mobilization and opening. So mobilization may involve, actually getting people into the right place for day one to open the new facility, potentially moving things from the old facility to the new facility from an operational perspective. And then, of course, actually opening the doors, letting people through the doors and starting to use the new facility, where hopefully at this point, we are simply executing the procedures and policies and processes that we developed way back in planning that we trained on, and then that we ultimately trialed and did dry runs on as we approached facility opening, to hopefully make facility opening a non-event. And then also there's post-opening or post-handover support. And so this often has to do with, just analyzing and auditing how things are going after day one, and, going back and tweaking, SOPs, COPs, systems, equipment where necessary to learn from the lessons that we learn as the facility opens. So this is a great kind of overview of the process of what ORAT is and some of the activities that take place in the various phases. And, I would also, again, just as where I'd remind you, I don't think this is necessarily completely unique to aviation, right? We have the acronym here, ORAT, specific to aviation, but these types of activities can benefit, any large capital project or any asset intensive industry where new systems, new equipment, or new facilities are being brought online. All right, so let's switch gears slightly and let's talk a little bit about digital asset data delivery, and then I'm going to attempt to weave the two subjects and concepts back together before we finish up. So digital asset data delivery, what is it? Why do we do it? Right. So I love this concept of the golden thread of data. This is a concept that was originated. Well, I think it's been around, but it was really coined as part of the official vernacular in design and construction. Back in 2021, in response to the Grenfell's Tower incident that took place in the UK. And basically, as they analyzed what happened in that disaster, one of the key findings was that there was critical information and decisions being made along the way where if that information had been made available to downstream people, the event that occurred that caused loss of life could potentially have been avoided. And so this term, the golden thread of data, was coined, which the definition of it is it's the information that allows you to understand a building and the steps needed to keep both the building and the people safe now and in the future. And so linking this back to the paradigm I set out there at the beginning of the presentation, where I say BIM is a methodology across the entire asset lifecycle, not just a software tool used in design and construction, I love marrying that paradigm up with this concept of the golden thread of data. And that's how I see BIM. I see BIM as a collection of technologies, but really more than that, a philosophy, a methodology, and a set of processes that allow the data around a facility, around a system, around an asset to flow freely across all the stakeholders that may be involved, whether we're talking about design, construction, or in the latter end of the process, operations and maintenance. And so it's this idea that all this critical data that's built up over time in the various phases of the asset lifecycle is made available to stakeholders in later stages of the asset lifecycle as well. This golden thread that carries us through the asset lifecycle. And why I think that's profound is if we look at traditional delivery of capital projects, and in particular traditional delivery of digital asset data or just asset data on projects, what we typically see is that this information is handed over in the form of static files. Whether we're talking about CAD or BIM, it's typically in PDF versions. We're talking about product submittals that are provided in PDF versions, so the details of my assets and the O&M manuals associated with my assets, it's basically all handed over kind of in one fell swoop at the end of the project, near handover if you're lucky. Sometimes it lags even after handover. But what you're left with is, as an owner or operator, you maybe feel pretty good about yourself for getting this file share, this disk that's filled with all these PDFs, and you feel good about the information you have. But when you start to try and use that information, you realize that the data needs to be extracted from those formats and it needs to be put into your enterprise systems that you use to operate and maintain the facility. And typically this isn't even done in an orchestrated manner on the owner side of the house. You have people who use, let's say, the GIS system going, oh, okay, there's data there that I could use and I want to put into my system and use in my processes. And so they'll embark on a project to extract that data and load it. From an enterprise asset management standpoint or CMMS standpoint, from a work management standpoint, same sort of thing happens. Oh, there's O&M data that'd be very useful to me to establish a PM program for these assets. So, I'm going to go mine those PDFs for the information I need out of there, and I'm going to move it into the EAM system. So across all these stakeholder groups and the enterprise systems that they use, it's independent efforts by people who want the data to go into this non-optimally provided data, pull out what they need, and translate it into what they need in their particular systems and for their processes. And so not only is that kind of a disjointed effort, you're lucky if that happens at handover. It's likely going to happen at different times in the months or even years that take place after handover. But also because of the manner in which it is typically handled, that data that goes into GIS lives independent of the other system. The data that goes into the enterprise asset management system lives independent of the other systems. And so not only did we fray the golden thread at handover, but it continues to get more and more frayed as these systems operate independently. So, it begs the question, is there a better way? There is a better way. So particularly for owners and operators that are savvy and invest in an asset registry or some form of a common data environment and embrace open BIM standards that you'll hear touted across the other webinars on the website at Building Smart. If an owner operator embraces this concept, embraces those systems, embraces those standards, they put themselves in a position to receive this data earlier in the project, and not only receive it earlier, but receive it in a manner that they have the ability to use it right immediately, not months or years after the handover has occurred, when they think they really need the data. It's a crisis at that point. They can bring it in and integrate it with their enterprise systems much earlier, and in doing so, it can support business processes and decisions that need to be made in those, while you're still in the capital project. But then also, and I think this is what's incredibly powerful, is, when orchestrated and done right, and you're integrating this data as it's available to your enterprise systems, and you're planning ahead, you're following a process like ORAT, ultimately project handover becomes a non-event, particularly from an asset data perspective. The asset parameters are already in your EAM system when you open the doors. The PM schedules have already been loaded and are in place when you open the doors. The assets that are being installed have already been located in space across your site, and you know where they are. Your depreciation schedules are already in the ERP system, ready to start ticking down at project handover. So what we have now is a means whereby this thread is maintained and not frayed. And that common data environment, that asset registry, and these open standards that support it become that binder that keeps this asset data in sync for the enterprise as you approach handover, and then as you proceed past handover. And I get into much more back in October, I did a presentation where I get into much more detail about this process. If you want to check out on LinkedIn, some of my articles, I talk a lot about digital asset data delivery on capital projects and how it can improve outcomes. But this is kind of the basic gist of the paradigm that I'm trying to get across. So how do we marry those two concepts together? My premise here is that better data enables better ORAT outcomes. And I like to look at the 4 A's of data interoperability. We want data that's abundant. So when we say better, this is the definition of better. It's data that's abundant. It's data that's accurate. It's data that's accessible. That's incredibly important. And it's data that's provided as soon as possible. And so if we can put processes in place and systems in place that allow us to get more data, accurate data, make it available to my stakeholders through my internal systems, and get it earlier in the process, then everything I do from an operational readiness standpoint becomes much more efficient and much more effective. So let's dive into that a little bit. As I was preparing for this presentation, I really went back. I had some lessons learned from previous airport, large capital project airports that I had participated on. But I really kind of wanted to go beyond that, just my experience, and study kind of this knowledge base, this field of ORAT, and hear what some of the lessons learned were from some other experts out there. And what I found interesting as I started to do that, as I started to collect the typical challenges with the ORAT process, I realized that they mapped very closely with what is touted as the benefits of BIM. And so I kind of had already jumped to that conclusion, obviously, but it was interesting to see how closely aligned the lessons learned from ORAT were to the benefits that are prescribed or touted for BIM, the BIM methodology. And so I want to just kind of walk through that a little bit, some of the challenges we typically see with ORAT and how it maps to a BIM benefit. So the first one is coordination, communication, and change management. So obviously, opening, as an example, a new airport terminal facility or any facility is a huge undertaking with a tremendous number of stakeholders. And so getting all of those people on the same page, communicating the right information at the right time to those people is a huge undertaking, and just organizational change management in general. It's an enormous change for an organization to undergo, and it's forced on them. And so this can be a huge challenge as we look at ORAT. Well, one of the most touted benefits of BIM is that it creates enhanced collaboration. It puts data in a single location, and it allows you to visualize it in such a way that you can bring multiple stakeholders together to look at the same information and then drive decision making, reviews and approvals, and all these various business processes, planning, drive it off that same core, very visual set of information. And so by interjecting BIM methodologies, BIM technologies into the planning process as we prepare for a new facility. And when I say planning, I mean operational planning, not just design and construction planning. We see that we can directly help or address, at least help, the coordination, communication, and change management challenges. The next one I want to look at is, a typical challenge we see with ORAT is resource, schedule, and budget management. It's an activity that, while it provides an immense amount of value, there's also a significant cost associated with it. And so, organizations really have to look at that cost benefit analysis to see if, a little bit of effort up front is going to provide significant value on the back end. And, with incredibly manual processes to do ORAT, that business case may not be always as compelling as we would hope or we would think. However, again, with the introduction of technology, when we look at one of the core BIM benefits, BIM is touted as a way through the planning, design, and construction process of increasing efficiency and reducing costs. Again, by making data more accessible and more available, by not having to export data out into other deliverables, not having to migrate or transition data from one place to another and reformat it. So we have these efficiency gains with a BIM-based methodology, a BIM platform that not only do they help efficiency from a design and construction coordination perspective, but they can also be used to help coordination and efficiency from an ORAT perspective. And in a little bit, we're going to look at some specific examples of how that can happen. And then the last one I kind of want to present, or category of challenges I want to present, is the idea training, development, and technology integration. And these are two separate things, but I kind of lumped them in together because they map to the same BIM benefit in my eyes. But identifying what training needs to take place for end users and ensuring that it gets done in an effective manner is obviously a huge challenge with ORAT. And then technology integration, getting people up to speed on new systems, getting all brand new systems integrated with each other can be a huge undertaking. And once again, we can map this to a typical benefit that's touted for BIM, which is improved visualization and access to data. And I'm going to walk through some specific examples of where this improved visualization can have an incredibly profound impact on, in particular, training development. So again, I just found it very interesting that as you kind of dissected some of the lessons learned and challenges with the ORAT process across numerous implementations of it across numerous airports, I immediately started thinking to the benefits that I've heard of the BIM methodology. All right, so let's talk a little bit more specifics than just in generality. So how does BIM support, ORAT. So the three areas we're going to look at today, and there's more than this, but I think these ones are pretty critical, pretty profound. One, it enables strategic planning, and I'm going to talk about a few ways in which it does that. It improves training and testing, so it puts us in a better position to do more effective training and more comprehensive testing. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then it also puts in a position, and me being, spending the better part of my 20 years in the asset management space, it gives us complete and accurate asset histories to work from. And to me, that's so critical. Honestly, this is probably the catalyst that kind of got me into this subject in the first place and got me thinking about BIM. Is, I spent 15 years implementing asset management systems, and then started to get involved in capital projects, and found all the data I'd been looking for 15 years. Our biggest challenge in implementing EAM systems was always getting the right data, getting complete data, getting accurate data. It was always the long pole in the tent from a critical path perspective. And so when I started to understand the design and construction process better, and virtual design and construction in particular, I found all the data I'd been missing for 15 years. And at that point, it kind of became my mission to improve this handover that takes place from capital projects into operations and maintenance, because there's just so much immense benefit and so much cost reduction. There's just so much opportunity for improvement in that particular gap between those asset lifecycle phases. So let's dive into these just a little bit deeper. So the first one, early data enables strategic planning, right? So what it gives us the ability to do, if I have access to digital asset data, ideally in the form of things like BIM models, but even in the form of like COBie exported data. When I have access to what is actually being planned, designed, and built early in the process, it makes it much easier to visualize and validate operational concepts. So I mentioned that's one of the first activities we have to do, is put together a concept of operation for the facility. And we can do that. We're engaging stakeholders, and we're trying to get them to imagine what this facility is going to look like at some point in the future, and go, okay, working in that facility, what do we need to have in place, right? How is it going to affect your day-to-day jobs and your operations? And so doing that from engineering drawings or from a whiteboard or from discussion can be particularly challenging. But when we have access to the asset data, particularly in the form of something like a BIM model, it becomes much easier to visualize what those impacts are going to be. And it becomes much easier to identify what are the things we need to plan for. So things just happen faster, and they're more comprehensive. We don't miss as much stuff. I recently had the opportunity to see a presentation by a BIM manager at a major cruise company, and his team's role, they actually have a BIM cave in their headquarters, and his team's role is to take the design models and construction models as the ship's being built, and use the Unreal video game engine to create these phenomenal and very realistic renderings of the ship long before it's been built. And so then they bring these stakeholders and decision makers into the BIM cave when they have important decisions to make or important things to plan for, where they can actually immerse themselves in the asset before it's actually been built. And what they're finding from a results standpoint is that decisions happen much faster, and the decisions that are made have much more confidence behind them. So putting ourselves in a position to be able to visualize this data earlier in the process makes all that decision making happen a lot quicker. And so certainly we've seen that benefit for some time from a design perspective and a construction coordination perspective. And I'm just asking us to kind of shift our paradigm a little bit and think about it from the perspective of planning for operations and planning for maintenance. It has the exact same benefit to be able to do this. And so kind of nice segue into talking about it enables strategic asset management planning as well. So, in an ideal world, if I want to maximize my total cost of ownership for a facility, I want to get way out ahead of taking over that facility and put preventive maintenance, proactive maintenance, run to failure, whatever the modes may be, put the right maintenance approaches in place for my assets well before I actually take over the facility. And that can be particularly challenging if I don't know exactly what's going into that new facility. So even just basic information like the scheduled systems or assets that are developing as we develop, first the space plan, and then conceptual design, and then design for construction, and then construction documents. As that gets elaborated and as we get that information, I can take those schedules and I can start doing very real, very tangible, asset management planning, asset investment planning, to determine, what level of service that type of asset is going to require and what type of maintenance plans I'm going to need to put in place, all the way down to the point of being able to even forecast what my maintenance costs are going to be on a yearly basis, or when I may need to start planning for capital renewal. So the earlier I can get my hands on this asset data, the better position I'm in to do this proactive planning that, again, we saw earlier can greatly reduce my total cost of ownership down the road. Of course, just piggybacking on what we've already talked about here, identification of required SOPs and COPs. Again, typically what we're doing in this exercise is we're asking stakeholders to tell us what they're going to need when we're talking about ORAT. That's typically and traditionally how it's done. We're saying, okay, what procedures do you have today that are going to need to carry forward and maybe be tweaked, or, based on what you know about this new facility, what new standard operating procedures or COPs do we, maybe need to have in place? And again, trying to do that from, a 2D engineering drawing, or just from, a conversation or a whiteboard meeting, it's difficult to kind of visualize and put yourself in the perspective of where you're going to be in the future to identify all those things. Whereas, if you can visualize this asset data, this very real asset data earlier in the process, it becomes much easier. I mean, even from the perspective of, again, just comparing to equipment schedules and what's going to be required in relation to those. And then along those exact same lines, the identification of required training. If it's easier to identify what type of procedures we're going to need to have in place by being able to visualize the facility well in advance, it follows on that would also be much easier to identify the required training as well. So, by having access to this data much earlier in the process, we can proactively kick off these processes. And like I said, for 30 years, we've been doing this in the aviation industry anyways, but by getting better asset data, we can become much more efficient at it, and we can improve the quality of our outcomes. So we basically perform the same tasks, we just do so in a more efficient manner, and with a higher quality output, or at least an output with much higher level of confidence. Another premise of mine is that early integration of both systems and data also improves the testing and training phase of ORAT. So kind of breaking this down, the ability to train with real data cannot be underestimated. Right. Too often I've been involved with software implementations my entire career, and too often, we're trying to train people on systems using demonstration data or data that we've fabricated to match the use case we're trying to train on, because we don't have the real data yet. And while you're still capable of getting across some of the major concepts about how that system or how that software is going to operate, it's just not quite the same as looking at the actual data, the real data that you're going to be using. And an example of this, and you guys can actually partake in this example as well, is I recently saw, and I have since checked out and played with, there's an application that you can get if you happen to have an Oculus Quest, or I guess it's called the Meta Quest now. But if you have that VR goggle set, there's an application that you can download called the Airport Ground Handling Simulator. And what this is you can actually go into a completely virtual reality environment with your Quest goggles on, and the little controllers, the hand controllers, and you can actually simulate the operations that take place on the ground when a plane comes in, gets serviced, and goes back out. And the implications of this, I think, are incredibly profound, right? This is kind of gamified to some degree to make it accessible to the general public, but this exact same concepts are being used to develop training programs where, again, I can take the model data, think outside the box a little bit, and use it in a completely different fashion from just construction coordination, and I can create real training scenarios, and I can put end users inside the facility that may not even be built yet, put them inside and actually have them run through processes. And I think it's going to just immensely transform the effectiveness of training as we have more and more ability to do that. And of course, we're just scratching the surface. This is probably a long way off for a lot of your organizations, but the main thing I want to get across is the technology is there. Right? The technology is not the hindrance to being able to do this. It's a matter of putting the right processes in place to have the data you would need to do this type of thing. And then, of course, the investment as well. But over time, we'll see that investment come down. Also running trials with real systems. And so, when we talk about the trial process, this is after the facility is actually been, largely constructed, but we haven't opened it to the public yet. We're executing our standard operating procedures. We're working with, hopefully the new software and equipment systems. We're running trials and we're running through various scenarios. And so, if we can actually utilize those systems during this period of time, then the effectiveness of those trials goes up immensely. And I was involved in a project recently at a major airport in the Northeast. That was just opening a new terminal. And, we were in a position to get their enterprise asset management system up and running and seeded with data in conjunction, in parallel with them running terminal trials. And that was a huge advantage to not just kind of hypothetically go through scenarios like, okay, you're going to have a work order spit out, then you're going to get contacted by the call center, you're going to fill out this portion, and instead of just having to kind of imagine how that would actually look, to be able to actually log into the real software, to use the actual handheld device, they were going to use, and be able to execute these trials with the real systems, put that group in a much more advantageous position as terminal opening approached. And this, of course, doing all this gives us the ability to identify issues early and adjust. The last thing we want is to be opening a brand new facility, have the general public in there, and we're running around trying to deal with software issues because the software didn't go live until the day of handover, or we're dealing with a lack of data issues because the data that we received in the handover has not been put into our operating systems or our maintenance systems yet. So having the ability to get our hands on this stuff and work with it while the facility is not yet open becomes incredibly advantageous to identifying issues and adjusting to those. Kind of the final category of benefits is that I'm presenting today is early system and data integration ensures complete histories. And again, from my background in asset management and reliability, this one is incredibly near and dear to my heart, and I think incredibly critical and may get overlooked a lot of times on projects. But when I have the data early and I have it integrated with my enterprise systems early, then I have the ability to capture history much sooner in the overall asset lifecycle. So I have the opportunity to capture installation and commissioning activities in my CMMS or in my enterprise asset management system. Of course, these activities go on today, and of course they get recorded, but often, again, that's being provided in a static handover as all the data from the project is being handed over. Whereas, if we have a more integrated BIM-based process from the owner's side, where we're receiving this data and integrating it earlier, there's no reason why we can't have installation and commissioning activities there in my enterprise systems in the history of my assets in whichever systems I may be managing them in. I also have the ability to capture pre-handover maintenance, right? So if things are occurring, there's typically a pretty long portion of time where an asset has been installed into a new facility, in particular, a new terminal facility, before the handover to the owner actually takes place or before it's open to the general public. There could be, months, even, up to a year where systems and assets are already in place long before the grand opening. And so having the ability, if we have this data and we have it in our systems, having the ability to capture the events that take place against those assets during that time period is critical, because that asset doesn't care when grand opening is. Its O&M phase of its life cycle started, after it was installed and commissioned and turned on. And then day one issues. Again, I talked about in a lot of cases, in most projects I've been involved with, at least across, the early years of my career, it was unheard of for us to actually have the asset records from a new facility in the EAM system on day one. We were typically in the throes of, just trying to keep people working during that time period and converting the data that was coming from the product data submittals into EAM asset records. I mean, if it was even being thought about at that point, it certainly wasn't being done until well after the dust settled on the grand opening. So if we can shift that integration and transition earlier, then we can actually utilize that data on day one, and everything that happens on day one, which is going to be a lot, can get captured in our system and become part of the asset history. And then another one, again, this is an area that I think most organizations I've worked with have a huge opportunity that they miss in leveraging warranty coverages. And the main reason is because even though those warranties may exist, they're not easily accessible where they need to be accessible to have any sort of effect. I need to have access to those as I'm processing a maintenance event or failure activity, maintenance activity or failure event, so that the light bulb can go off that, hey, I should reach out to the vendor and maybe they'll do something about this. So if we have the ability to capture that information, integrate it with our enterprise systems, we can proactively flag those occurrences, and we're in a much better position to leverage the warranty coverages we have. So, these are some significant opportunities that are now in play if we have integrated asset data early. And why do I say this is so critical? Many of you may have seen this already, but it's what's referred to often in reliability as the bathtub curve. That, if we look at the typical failures or rate of failures that occur on an asset across its life cycle, it tends to look something like this, where we have a higher instance of failures early on when it's first installed. That could be because it's a bad actor. That could be because it was installed improperly. That could be because the design of the system was poor for the asset that was put in that position. But there's a lot of factors that cause that asset to fail at a higher rate at the beginning of the life cycle. That tends to taper off, in the middle of the life cycle, where you're getting, mostly, contextual based or random failures. And then as it gets older, it starts to fail at a higher rate, as things start to wear out, right? But so what you end up with is the observed failure rate looks like, kind of a bathtub, where it's higher in the front and higher in the back and lower in the middle. Well, why is this critical? Well, the commissioning and opening activity takes place right at the beginning of that bathtub curve. And so if we don't have our system in place to capture this history, we are missing a significant number of activities and incidents and data that will serve us very well later on. I'm going to be maintaining this facility for 30, 40, 50, maybe even more years. And so to have that blind spot at the beginning of the asset history for my assets can be pretty profound when I'm trying to look at how I can extend the life and minimize the cost of this particular asset. So, it's just kind of ironic that historically, the time when we probably need the CMMS system the most, we don't have the right data in it because of the way this project data gets transitioned. All right, I want to leave you with some final thoughts in relation to all of this to kind of sum up the messages I've been trying to get across today. The concept of ORAT is just good asset management. right? So when we look at this methodology, really, it's everything that I try and talk about on my soapbox about bringing asset management earlier into the capital planning and design and construction process. ORAT is a methodology that does that. It brings asset management earlier into the process to improve outcomes once that facility has been handed over. And earlier asset data improves ORAT. Hopefully I've been able to show, some concepts and some examples of where having our hands on this asset data earlier makes the ORAT process more efficient and more effective. And then kind of the final main point, open BIM processes and BIM methodology in general enables earlier asset data. And so kind of circling back to my message at the beginning, if you're an owner operator, part of what I'm trying to do here is convince you to continue to push inside your own organization for more participation in the planning, design, and construction phases. And in particular, look at the possibility of implementing better data standards, of implementing an asset registry that receives this data sooner, of implementing common data environments to kind of support these business process that could be greatly improved by access to this data. And if you're, an architect or a builder, I would say, look at the value that your work products have the capability to provide to owners. And this might be a great place for you to actually market those capabilities to owners and help them along the way of this journey. So at the end of the day, that was kind of my objective, is to get everybody thinking about how, BIM goes so much farther beyond just design and construction coordination and can actually enable, significant value in downstream business processes for ultimately the owner operator of the facility. All right, last thing I'll leave you with here is just a quote from my life coach. There were two buttons I never like to hit. That's the panic and the snooze. So if I can leave you with anything as it relates to open BIM standards, is that there's no expectation that you're well along this evolution and you've got to do a ton of change overnight. There's no cause for panic. Adoption is happening at kind of its own pace across industry, and you're still very much in a position to be able to take advantage and leverage what's being developed. But the key is you need to start now, which is the other part of this quote, which is don't hit the snooze button early. So don't panic. There's still time to get value, but don't snooze either. If your organization is not looking at how they can utilize BIM and open BIM standards and COBie and IFC and IDS, I highly recommend that you start looking at and start putting a strategy and a roadmap in place for your organization. That is it for me today. It looks like I may have managed to leave a few minutes left for questions. That's an accomplishment for me. So if anybody has any questions, I would appreciate it if you put them in the chat, and we'll try and grab them out of there, and I'll try and address them on here before we wrap up.
Scott, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And you see applause is coming up on the screen for you. We do have one question, which is, what are the most effective methods to help teams extract data requirements from their SOPs and COPs? And then how do you collect them, fold them into a master list to specify the asset registry?
Yeah, so this is an area where I think there is a lot of opportunity and work still to be done. And I'll be honest, I'm somewhat new at this piece as well. I'm going through an education on COBie right now, and my initial exposure to COBie was, okay, this is how you can get asset records out of your BIM model and figure out what's actually being installed and maybe migrate them into your asset management system. But as I've studied COBie more, come to realize the portion of COBie that handles things like jobs, which can be operations that need to take place related to systems and assets, as well as maintenance that needs to take place as it relates to systems and assets. And so this is data that typically comes to you through O&M manuals. But if you can write standards and incorporate on your projects that you're going to receive this data in COBie format, it puts you in a position to more easily extract that information and integrate it into downstream systems. Now, I'll be the first one to say, I think Europe's ahead of the game on this, but in North America, in the US in particular, I think we're a little bit behind. I'll be honest with you, I haven't been involved in a project yet that is truly using that portion of COBie, but I think there's an immense opportunity to do so. And taking it a step farther, this is an area where I see the application of AI being hugely beneficial. Certainly in the creation and acquisition of that information just through general mining of the knowledge that's out there. So if I got a schedule of assets, being able to use AI to go out and figure out what operating procedures I need to have in place, what maintenance I need to have in place, that's an area where we could see benefit. But even from the perspective of extracting data out of documents, if you are still getting paper documents with operational procedures or contingency procedures, whatever they may be, AI is a great tool to say, hey, go into this document, I'm looking for this specific information, and pull it out for me. So I know it may be a little bit of a cheat code, but this is kind of one of the areas that I'm really looking at artificial intelligence to help us with some of these activities where we're just talking about extracting a little bit of data out of a sea of data and moving it somewhere else. But so I would look at the standards that exist for acquiring this information and incorporating those in your organization. And then I'd be creative about how to use technology in automating that process as well.
Okay, we have one more question from Manny. If you have time to answer that, can you see it on your screen, Scott?
I do, yeah. So what has been your experience in terms of facility operators using BIM as an interface to access asset data in 3D versus using reality capture, for example, 360 reality capture walkthrough as the interface to organize the asset data in 3D? And I'm gonna do an interpretation of this question. I think it's asking about I guess I'm just trying to discern whether it's talking about doing the data capture or the use of the data. I'll try and kind of address both, right? So from a data capture perspective, I think BIM modeling gets you there quicker, especially if you're tapping into, if you're engaged on the capital project itself. There's data that is beyond what you can capture through a scan that you ultimately need. And so if you've got the right standards in place, the people that are building the models can actually incorporate this data at that time, at the appropriate time, at the most efficient time. So whether that's, as equipment's being selected in design, and so the properties of that equipment are being added, or whether we're going through commissioning activities and those commissioning activities are being captured against the BIM model in a parametric fashion. My position here is that if you have the right standards in place, you're collecting all of that data in your BIM model as you're going through this process. Whereas with reality capture, I think it's fantastic for catching up the process and maybe accelerating the process if you don't have the best standards in place, because it's certainly incredibly effective at capturing as is situations, whether you're talking about existing facilities or whether you're talking about at the end of construction trying to bring your models up to date. There's obviously some effort there, either through technology or manual effort, to convert what's in the reality capture to actual asset data. And then, like I said before, some of this data just can't be captured through that process. Some of it is, event data or operational and procedural data that has to be manually input. And so I don't know, hopefully I kind of gave you, I don't know that I gave you an explicit answer on that question, but hopefully I kind of gave you enough information on how both those technologies play in.
Great, Scott. Thank you again. This has been an eye-opening, very well presented presentation that's unfolded nicely, given us a lot of practical experience expressed in a way that we can all move to employ it directly in our work starting today, which is
Absolutely.
the aim to do. So thank you very much for this. We'll conclude the webinar now. It'll be posted online, and if anyone has questions they weren't able to ask, please just forward them and we'll make sure to get them to Scott.
Absolutely. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.